Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive? Today, we're tackling something you might not have heard of before. Ex-Post Facto Research. Ever feel like you're trying to solve a puzzle, but someone already put all the pieces together?
Mhm. Yeah.
Well, that's kind of what this type of research is all about. It's about investigating possible causes, but after an effect has already happened.
What's so intriguing about ex post facto research is that, unlike traditional experiments where you're in control and can manipulate variables, here you start with the outcome, the effect,
Right?
and then work backward to figure out what might have led to it.
So it's less about controlling the situation and more about being a detective, right?
Yeah.
Like I read in one of the sources that a good way to understand this is to think about a situation where a child is exhibiting delinquent behavior.
Hmm.
An ex post facto researcher isn't going to try to make a kid act out that would be seriously messed up.
Yeah, no, of course not.
Instead, they look back at all sorts of factors that might have contributed, like family dynamics, what's happening at school, their social circle, that kind of thing.
That's a great example. You're essentially piecing together the story based on the evidence that's already there.
Hmm.
It's like a forensic scientist analyzing a crime scene.
Okay.
You're looking at the clues to reconstruct the events that led to the outcome.
Okay, so how do we formally define ex post facto research? In a way that makes sense to someone who isn't a research scientist.
Yeah.
One of the sources had this pretty dense definition: an empirically based investigation in which the independent variable or variables have already occurred. Therefore, the researcher starts with the observation of a dependent variable or variables. It's a mouthful, right?
Yeah.
How would you explain that to someone who's like, what?
Um, uh, I think a simpler way to put it is that ex post facto research is all about trying to understand why something happened by looking at the factors that came before it. You're not manipulating anything. The cause, or the independent variable, as researchers call it, is already in the past. What you can do is carefully choose control groups to compare. Groups of people who didn't experience the same outcome.
So you're basically saying, okay, this group of kids had this outcome, this other group didn't. What's different about their backgrounds or experiences that might explain why?
Precisely. And by comparing these groups, you can start to tease out potential causes and understand the relationship between different factors and the effect you're interested in.
Got it. Now, how does this differ from the kind of research we usually hear about? Where scientists run experiments and control all the variables. Our source had this handy table comparing ex post facto research to experimental research.
Yeah. The biggest difference boils down to control. In experimental research, you get to call the shots. You can manipulate variables, randomly assign people to different groups, and really isolate the cause and effect. But in ex post facto research, you're dealing with events that have already happened. You can't go back in time and change things or randomly assign people to experience something that's already occurred.
So it's like the difference between setting up a controlled lab experiment and trying to figure out why a forest fire started after it's already burned out.
That's a perfect analogy. In the forest fire scenario, you can't recreate the exact conditions that led to the fire, but you can still investigate the scene, analyze burn patterns, and look for clues that point to the cause. And that's very much what ex post facto research is all about.
Okay, so if you're not in control of the variables and you can't randomly assign people to different groups, how can you be sure you're finding the real cause and not just some random coincidence?
That's where the real detective work comes in. The source we're looking at highlights three key things that researchers have to consider when they're trying to figure out causation in ex post facto research. First, there has to be a clear connection between the suspected cause and the effect. This is what researchers call association.
So basically, if there's no link, there's no point in investigating further, right?
Exactly. It'd be like trying to solve a murder without a body. You need some evidence that a crime even happened in the first place. The second thing researchers look at is the timing of events. The suspected cause has to happen before the effect, or at least at the same time.
Makes sense. Cause has to come before effect. No time travel allowed in research.
Right. Now, the third thing, and this is probably the trickiest part, is ruling out all those other possible explanations. Just because two things happened around the same time doesn't mean one caused the other. Think about that classic example of ice cream sales and shark attacks, both increasing in the summer.
No, yeah.
It's a classic case of correlation not equaling causation. Both are influenced by a third factor, warm weather. So you might see a connection, but doesn't mean one thing directly caused the other. And that's why it's so important for researchers to be super thorough and really think critically when they're doing ex post facto research. They've got to make sure they haven't jumped to the wrong conclusion.
It's like in those mystery novels where the detective initially suspects the most obvious person, but as they dig deeper, they uncover all these hidden motives and unexpected connections.
I love that analogy. It really highlights how important it is to thoroughly investigate and consider all angles. Now, speaking of detective work, let's walk through the actual steps involved in conducting ex post facto research. Our source outlines a pretty clear process, and it aligns perfectly with that detective analogy we've been using.
Okay, so just like a detective arrives at a crime scene, what's the first step a researcher takes when they're starting an ex post facto study?
The first step is to clearly identify the problem. What's the mystery you're trying to solve? What's the effect that has you scratching your head and wanting to dig deeper?
So you're basically figuring out the boundaries of the investigation, right? Yeah. Defining what you're trying to explain.
Exactly. Once you've got that, it's time to hit the books. Seriously, a thorough literature review is essential. You need to see what other researchers have already found out about this topic, what theories exist, and what gaps in knowledge you might be able to fill. It's like gathering intel before you head out on a mission.
So you're not reinventing the wheel, but building on what others have already discovered.
Exactly. Armed with all that knowledge, you can then start formulating hypotheses. These are your educated guesses about the possible explanations for the effect you're investigating.
So the hypothesis is like the detective's initial suspect list.
That's a great way to put it. Now remember, in ex post facto research, we can't manipulate the independent variable. That means selecting the right sample and data collection methods is super important. You want to make sure you're gathering the most relevant and reliable information possible, given the constraints.
It's all about working with the evidence you have, not wishing you had different evidence.
Precisely. Once you've gathered all your data, it's time to roll up your sleeves and dive into the analysis. This is where you really start to examine the relationships between variables and see if those hypotheses hold up.
So this is where the data starts to tell its story, right?
Yeah.
And you begin to see if your initial hunches were on the right track.
Exactly. But before you jump to conclusions and declare the case closed, it's crucial to validate your findings. Are they reliable? Do they make sense in the context of existing research? You've got to make sure you haven't overlooked anything or misinterpreted the evidence.
It's like double-checking your work, making sure all the pieces of the puzzle really fit together.
Right. And only then can you confidently draw conclusions and interpret what it all means in the bigger picture. So you see, ex post facto research really is a journey of discovery. Now that we understand the process, let's see why a researcher might choose this approach in the first place.
That's a great transition. So let's talk about the strengths of ex post facto research. What makes it a valuable tool in a researcher's toolbox?
Well, one of the biggest advantages is that it allows researchers to study situations where it would be ethically problematic or practically impossible to manipulate variables. Take the example we discussed earlier about childhood trauma. You can't ethically inflict trauma on children for research purposes.
Of course not.
So,
That's a really powerful point. So ex post facto research allows us to learn from real-world situations that we couldn't ethically recreate in a lab setting.
exactly. It opens up a whole world of research possibilities, especially in fields like sociology, education, and health, where many of the phenomena we're interested in are things we can't control or manipulate directly. Another great thing about ex post facto research is that it can be very efficient. You're often working with data that's already been collected, which can save a lot of time and resources compared to conducting a brand new study from scratch.
So it's a great option for researchers who want to make the most of existing information and resources.
Right.
It's all about being resourceful, right?
Absolutely. But of course, no research method is without its limitations. There are some important weaknesses to keep in mind when considering ex post facto research.
Okay, so what are some of the things we need to watch out for? What are the potential pitfalls?
Well, the biggest challenge, and we've touched on this already, is that lack of control. Because you can't manipulate variables or randomly assign participants, it's much harder to definitively prove a cause and effect relationship. There's always the chance that some other hidden factor is actually driving the observed effect.
Right. There's always the possibility of those lurking variables, those things you might not even be aware of that are influencing the results.
Exactly. And that brings us to a common logical fallacy that can trip up even experienced researchers, the post hoc fallacy.
Ooh, that sounds ominous. What exactly is this fallacy all about, and why is it so important to be aware of it?
The post hoc fallacy basically boils down to this: assuming that just because event B happened after event A, then A must have caused B. It's a very tempting trap to fall into because our brains are naturally wired to look for patterns and connections.
I can see how that would be easy to do. We see two things happening in a sequence and automatically assume there must be a causal link.
That's right. But remember, correlation doesn't equal causation. Our source uses a great example to illustrate this fallacy. Imagine you're looking at research that shows a correlation between children who exhibit delinquent behavior and being raised in a single-parent household.
So someone might jump to the conclusion that being raised by a single parent causes delinquency.
Exactly. But that's the post hoc fallacy in action. There could be so many other factors at play that might explain that correlation.
Like what kinds of things?
Well, think about socioeconomic factors. Maybe single-parent households are more likely to experience financial stress, which could then impact the child's behavior.
Sure.
Or maybe it has to do with social support. Perhaps children in single-parent households have less access to positive role models or structured activities. There could be a whole web of interconnected factors contributing to the observed correlation, and it's way too simplistic to just assume that one thing directly caused the other.
So basically, it's like assuming that wearing your lucky socks caused your favorite team to win. There might be a correlation, but there's probably not a direct causal link.
Perfect example.
Yeah.
It's all about recognizing that the world is complex and human behavior is influenced by a multitude of factors.
It sounds like ex post facto research requires a lot of careful thinking and a healthy dose of skepticism.
Absolutely. It's a powerful tool, but it has to be used responsibly and with a critical eye. You've got to be willing to question your assumptions and look for alternative explanations.
So it's not just about crunching numbers and looking at statistics.
Right.
It's about really understanding the context and considering all the possibilities.
That's right. It's about being a good detective, gathering all the evidence, and then piecing together the most plausible explanation based on the information you have.
Okay, so we've talked about the strengths and weaknesses of ex post facto research.
Yes. Now, before we wrap up, let's do a quick recap of what we've learned about ex post facto research so far.
Sounds good. We started by defining ex post facto research as a way of investigating possible causes after an effect has already happened. It's like being a detective, piecing together clues to understand why something happened the way it did.
Right. And unlike in experimental research, where you can manipulate variables and control the situation, ex post facto researchers have to work with what's already happened.
Yeah.
They can't go back in time or change anything.
So they're like those forensic scientists we see on TV, carefully examining the evidence and trying to reconstruct the events that led to the outcome.
Exactly. And you brought up a really important point earlier about the need to be cautious about jumping to conclusions in ex post facto research. Remember, just because two things are correlated doesn't mean one caused the other.
Yeah, that whole ice cream sales and shark attacks thing really made that point clear. Just because they both go up in the summer doesn't mean one is causing the other.
That's why it's so important to think critically and be aware of the post hoc fallacy, which is that tendency to assume that if B happened after A, then A must have caused B.
Right. It's tempting to make that leap, but as we've seen, it's not always accurate.
And we also talked about how researchers try to make sense of the data they collect in ex post facto research.
Yeah.
They look for those three key things: association, order of events, and ruling out alternative explanations.
Yeah, they've got to make sure there's a real connection between the suspected cause and the effect, that the cause actually happened before the effect, and that they haven't overlooked some other factor that might explain what they're seeing.
Exactly. So ex post facto research can be a powerful tool for understanding complex situations where we can't manipulate variables or run controlled experiments. It helps us to explore the why behind things that have already happened.
And it can be particularly useful in fields like sociology, education, and health, where so many of the questions we're trying to answer involve things that are out of our control. But it's also important to remember that it has its limitations, and researchers need to be careful about jumping to conclusions and oversimplifying complex situations.
That's a great summary. And to build on that, it's important to remember that even with those limitations, ex post facto research can still generate important hypotheses and insights that can then be explored further with other research methods.
So it's not always about finding definitive answers.
Right.
Sometimes it's about opening up new avenues of inquiry and sparking further investigation.
Precisely. And that's one of the most exciting things about research in general.
Yeah.
It's a continuous process of discovery, and each new piece of knowledge builds upon what came before.
Now, before we sign off, I want to leave you with a little something to think about. We've been talking about ex post facto research in a pretty theoretical way, but I bet you use this kind of thinking in your everyday life all the time, even if you don't realize it.
That's a great point. I'm sure many of our listeners can relate to that.
Think about a time when something happened, maybe you aced a test, or your favorite sports team won a big game, or you achieved a personal goal. Now think about all the things that might have contributed to that outcome.
It's a great way to put those detective skills to work in your own life.
You were probably doing a little bit of ex post facto research without even knowing it. You were looking back at the events leading up to the outcome and trying to figure out what made a difference. So the next time you find yourself trying to understand why something happened,
Yeah.
remember the principles of ex post facto research.
Right.
Look for those connections, consider the timing of events, and don't rule out those alternative explanations.
Mm-hmm.
And most importantly, don't be afraid to ask questions and keep digging deeper. Who knows what intriguing discoveries you might make along the way?
Well said. And remember, curiosity is the key to unlocking new knowledge and expanding our understanding of the world around us.
That's it for today's deep dive into ex post facto research. We hope you've enjoyed joining us on this journey of discovery, and we hope you've learned a few things along the way.
And we encourage you to keep exploring the fascinating world of research methods.
Yes.
There's so much out there to discover.
Until next time, happy learning. So the next time you find yourself trying to understand why something happened,
Yeah.
remember the principles of ex post facto research. Look for those connections, consider the timing of events, and don't rule out those alternative explanations. And most importantly, don't be afraid to ask questions and keep digging deeper. Who knows what intriguing discoveries you might make along the way?
Well said. And remember, curiosity is the key to unlocking new knowledge and expanding our understanding of the world around us.
That's it for today's deep dive into ex post facto research. We hope you've enjoyed joining us on this journey of discovery, and we hope you've learned a few things along the way.
And we encourage you to keep exploring the fascinating world of research methods. There's so much out there to discover.
Until next time, happy learning.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Your support helps us keep creating valuable content like this. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss an update. Join our community for more insights into psychology and personal development. Let's grow and learn together. See you